Welcome back to the Budget Gamer channel, where we bring you critical and in-depth reviews of just about every indie game we can get our hands on, and today we're going to be taking a look at Narita Boy for the Nintendo Switch. And if you've looked into this one at all, it's pretty obviously a retro 80s throwback, with not only visual cues in its graphic presentation, but also a heavy Tron-inspired theme throughout its entire story. More or less, Narita Boy, the iconic flagship game of an early 80s gaming console, fell prey to its own archetypal enemy, him. And in order to take over the Narita Boy world, him reached out of the monitor, wiped the game's creator's memories, leaving it with no oversight or moderation, and otherwise set on a path of destruction and chaos. However, the other denizens of the gaming world saw fit to enact the Narita Boy protocol, which zapped an avid gaming fan into the game world in order to destroy him, save the world, and return the creator's memories. But getting into the actual game, after you've gotten the backstory from the opening visuals, do prepare yourself for a lot of text dumps that may or may not be more intrinsically valuable to you actually trying to play the game. Personally, the further I got into the gameplay, the less I continued reading them, and I really didn't find it to impact my success. And that's because overall, Narita Boy is a pretty straightforward adventure game. The general level areas will have some moderate platforming, and the overall progression of the game is pretty well scripted. That being said, this 6 or more hour campaign through Narita Boy is actually divided into a lot of locked off chapters that directly tie the game world into the real world. And as you achieve milestone after milestone, you'll be sent back into little tidbits of the creator's memories as you gain abilities, defeat in-game bosses, and work slowly to restore the order of the world. Other than that, related to the game's genre, or to the game's progression, however you want to look at it, there are several different gaming styles blended in. Because at certain points of the game, you'll have to break through key sequences, which might change the average platforming hack-and-slash style of the game into a surfing simulation or even a speeder bike runner style gameplay. And while each of these different aspects will certainly spice up the gameplay, they do come with their own issues and potentially frustrations. Thankfully though, the staple combat system of the game is pretty darn straightforward. You have your typical 3-set combo hack and slash, as well as a ranged attack and an epic beam that'll kind of clear the screen. Or at least this is what you start off the game with, because as you play you do unlock new abilities. Now these aren't quite a Metroid or Metroid Prime style ability that helps you open new areas as much as merely engage with new specific types of enemies. Certain enemies may seem somewhat avoidable, and a dash might allow you to get behind their charging attacks. A shoulder dash might help you get past enemies with shields, and a few other attack styles that you unlock help you engage with more specific enemies in probably more effective ways. But overall, they don't really spice up combat that much per se, and you can still rely almost exclusively on the initial gaming attacks that you start the game with. Enemies are pretty straightforward though, so you will be encountering them all throughout the gameplay, and they do key you off a bit to the level's progression. Because Narita Boy does have elements of exploration thrown in. You'll have to find discs and find doors and find the locks for the keys, which will require a significant amount of backtracking, but as I said before, being that Narita Boy is fairly well scripted, you might find yourself backtracking through the same gaming areas several times, which not only makes it easier to recognize where certain keys might be needed later on, but can also make it a little bit less clear as to where to go next. But if you're worried about constantly getting swarmed by enemies at every turn in the game, plus the crazy boss fights, you don't really have to worry about death all too much, as there's no really obvious penalty. After all, this is a gaming world and Narita Boy is merely data, so the data can be regenerated at any nearest checkpoint. And in most cases, that'll be right next to where you just died. And so even though certain portions of Narita Boy might be fairly challenging, with the lack of penalty upon death, Narita Boy as a whole as an adventure game is pretty attainable. But moving away from gaming dynamics and story and getting into Narita Boy's presentation, it is absolutely flippin' gorgeous, and I don't think anyone would ever argue that point. Its amazing graphics combined with its truly amazing synthwave soundtrack work to create an unparalleled experience, especially with such an awesome trippy story. And I have to say, for at least the first couple hours of gameplay, I was blown away. But that being said, I do have to clarify for the first few hours of gameplay. Because there are some things about Narita Boy that do need to be noted before you dive in. And the first and foremost of which would have to be that Narita Boy feels a bit light. And I don't mean this as dealing with the story or anything like that, because, I mean, there's huge lore text dumps all throughout the game to give you as much depth as you could possibly handle. And with the backtracking into the creator's mind and seeing his memories, there is a lot to the game. But as far as the actual gameplay itself goes, it seems to be light. The exploration feels casual. And even the combat itself with new abilities, you're not really getting new ways to fight, you're only getting new abilities to target specific enemies, which to me personally feels a bit like combative box checking. But again, whether a game feels to be light or less involved than one would expect is, again, based on gaming experience. So for me it might feel light, for someone else it will probably feel full and rich. But another note, and a minor note, that will definitely affect anyone who is a fan of the more explorative-based platformers getting into the genre of Metroidvania. And that is the fact that you will have to play through the game, finding keys, finding elements, finding, again, the doors that those keys might go to, which, as I mentioned earlier in the review, does take a good bit of backtracking. And while backtracking itself isn't the issue, the fact that you don't have a map is a bit of an issue. Now, with the linear game progression and the fact that enemies will pop up where you're supposed to be, it all helps coach the player in where they need to go. But the complete lack of a map to help guide the player, while obviously not game-breaking, just seemed like an odd design choice. Moving on though, and as I've hinted at before, the deeper you get into the game, the more the genres start to change through those iconic thresholds. And whether that's as simple as transforming your body into a deer to wander through a forest, or turning into a giant robot to destroy absolutely everything in your path, each gameplay style brings its own elements, which means they'll be more well suited to certain types of players. And so you might find yourself actively engaging in a 2D adventure game, and then find yourself required to play through a runner-style game, which may or may not be your jam. And so in that sense, different gamers with different tastes in gaming will experience different, sometimes extreme difficulty spikes. But like I said before, Narita Boy doesn't really punish you for death, so you'll get as many chances as you could possibly want to play through any sticky spots. It's just, again, something to be aware of. But pushing back and looking at Narita Boy as an entire experience, and this is one of those games that I only picked up because honestly it is a little bit higher on the price point for myself. I only picked it up based on fan suggestion, so I know there is a huge audience that is absolutely in love with this game. But for me personally, while I did really enjoy it, it left me a little bit conflicted as to how my own experience really went. It was so cool and it was so interesting and the character designs were awesome for the characters and for the enemies and the levels and the bosses. But while certain aspects of the game itself were challenging, the combat generally wasn't. And while there was lots to explore for, I didn't feel the exploration was per se very inspired. And so while Narita Boy is inarguably a really good game, comparing Narita Boy to itself for the potential that it had to be an amazing game, I guess certain aspects of it just weren't quite as satisfying as I would have hoped they would have been in comparison to all of the other bits. So do I regret buying it? No, heck no. Especially because I got it on sale for like 12 bucks. It was totally worth it. But was it really what I had hoped and expected it to be, even based on its own advertisements on the eShop? Well, honestly, no. Because that one little eShop video was 100% hype. And that's typically why I try and go into these reviews blind. But anyway, that does about draw us to the close of the review of Narita Boy, now on the Nintendo Switch. So if you enjoyed the review, or especially if you found it helpful, feel free to throw us a comment or a like to show your support, and don't forget to click that little bell icon when you subscribe to stay updated with the latest content. Because I am putting out about 2 reviews a week on Mondays and Fridays, probably of indie games you've never even heard of. So with the thousands of indie games out there, chances are, whether it's an easy hard pass or an absolutely unforgettable gem, you're probably going to find out about it right here. But anyway, this has been The Budget Gamer, so as always, thanks for watching.